The screaming had stopped 3 hours ago, and that was what terrified Casimir the most. He pressed his back against the cold concrete wall of the abandoned pharmaceutical building, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air of what used to be downtown Minneapolis. Through the dirt-streaked window, he could see them, dozens of infected humans stumbling through the snow-covered streets, their movements jerky and unnatural, their skin mottled with the characteristic gray-purple bruising of the Romero virus. The silence meant one of two things: either everyone in the surrounding blocks was dead, or they had learned to stop screaming. Casimir adjusted the makeshift barricade he had constructed from filing cabinets and office furniture, his calloused hands working automatically while his mind raced through calculations. Former architect, current survivor, he had spent the last 6 weeks since the outbreak learning to think differently. Buildings were no longer structures to admire but fortresses to defend or traps to avoid. His analytical mind, which once designed award-winning sustainable housing, now plotted escape routes and catalogued potential weapons. The notebook in his jacket pocket contained detailed observations about the infected, their movement patterns, their reaction to stimuli, their apparent inability to climb smooth surfaces higher than 6 feet. Knowledge was survival, and Casimir had become a voracious student of this new, horrifying curriculum. A soft footfall behind him made Casimir spin, his hand instinctively reaching for the crowbar at his belt. He relaxed marginally when he recognized Nadira emerging from the stairwell, her dark hair pulled back severely from her face, medical kit slung across her shoulders. Before the outbreak, she had been a trauma surgeon at Hennepin Healthcare. Now, she was the only thing standing between their small group and death from infected wounds, illness, or the countless injuries that came with surviving in a world that had forgotten civilization. Her eyes, dark and perpetually exhausted, met his with the same question they asked every morning: how bad is it? 17 visible from this position, Casimir reported quietly, keeping his voice low. Sound traveled unpredictably in the urban landscape, and the infected had proven to have unnervingly acute hearing. Mostly scattered, no horde formation yet. But the screaming stopped. Nadira's jaw tightened. She understood the implication. She moved to the window, careful not to create a silhouette, and surveyed the scene with clinical detachment. Her fingers drummed against her thigh, a nervous habit she had developed in the past weeks, a metronome of anxiety she could not control. Theron's group should have been back 2 hours ago, she said, glancing at the watch she wore despite the battery having died weeks ago. The gesture was pure muscle memory, a remnant of the ordered world they had lost. Casimir felt the familiar twist of worry in his gut. Theron, their strategist and planner, had taken Lucien and Yold on a supply run to the pharmacy 3 blocks west. 3 blocks might as well have been 3 miles in the current reality. Every expedition was a gamble with death, but staying put meant slow starvation. They had long since consumed the vending machine contents and office snack stashes. Without medication, without food, without water purification tablets, they were simply choosing a different way to die. The sound of shattering glass erupted from somewhere below them, followed by a distinctive clicking sound, the horrible noise the infected made when they detected prey. It was not quite a vocalization, more like the sound of dry joints popping repeatedly, a biological echolocation that made Casimir's skin crawl every time he heard it. Nadira's hand flew to the radio clipped to her belt, but Casimir stopped her with a gesture. Radio silence unless absolutely necessary. The devices they had scavenged from a security office were their lifeline, but every transmission was a risk, a beacon that could draw unwanted attention. Then they heard it, 3 sharp knocks, a pause, 2 more knocks. Their signal. Casimir and Nadira exchanged a glance of profound relief before moving quickly to the stairwell. They descended 3 floors, weapons ready, alert for any signs that the code had been compromised. The infected had shown no capacity for mimicry or complex behavior, but paranoia was a survival trait now, not a disorder. At the ground-level service entrance, reinforced with chains and a heavy wooden beam, they found Theron pressing against the door, his face visible through the small window they had cleared in the painted glass. Blood covered the left side of his tactical jacket, and his eyes were wild with adrenaline and fear. Behind him, Casimir could see Yold supporting someone, Lucien, his leg dragging, leaving a dark trail on the pavement. And behind them, in the gathering dusk, shapes were moving with terrible purpose. Not stumbling. Not wandering. Moving with the coordinated intention of a pack that had found prey. The infected were learning, adapting, and the rules that had kept Casimir's group alive until now were changing in ways they did not yet understand. Casimir's hands moved with practiced efficiency, removing the wooden beam while Nadira kept her crossbow trained on the door. They had learned early that guns attracted every infected within a half-mile radius. The crossbow was silent, reloadable, and lethal at close range. The moment the barrier was clear, Theron practically fell through the entrance, turning immediately to help Yold drag Lucien inside. The scout's face was ashen, his breathing shallow, and the blood, there was so much blood soaking through his pants leg. Casimir slammed the door shut while Nadira dropped to her knees beside Lucien, her medical training overriding everything else. "Bite?" she asked, the single word carrying the weight of a death sentence. Yold shook her head violently, her blonde hair falling loose from its practical braid, her angular face streaked with grime and tears. "Glass. He fell through a window. No bite, no scratches from them, I swear it." Nadira was already cutting away the fabric, exposing a deep laceration that ran from Lucien's knee to mid-thigh. Deep, but clean. Survivable, if infection did not set in, the traditional kind, not the kind that turned you into a clicking, shambling nightmare. She pulled antiseptic and sutures from her kit, working with the calm precision that had saved countless lives in her previous existence. Theron leaned against the wall, chest heaving, and finally looked at Casimir with an expression that mixed shame and defiance. "It was going perfectly," he said, his voice rough. "We got into the pharmacy, found antibiotics, pain medication, water purification tablets, everything on the list. But there was a nest." The word sent a chill through everyone present. A nest meant the infected had begun congregating in groups, remaining stationary in enclosed spaces like some horrible parody of rest. The behavioral shift had been observed only in the last week, and it suggested cognitive development that was terrifying in its implications. "How many?" Casimir asked, though part of him did not want to know. Theron wiped blood from a cut above his eyebrow, his own blood, from his own injury. 12, maybe 15, in the back storage area. They were just standing there, swaying. We were so quiet, so careful. But Lucien backed into a display, and he did not need to finish. The clicking had started, the nest had activated, and the careful stealth operation had become a desperate fight for survival. Yold finally spoke, her voice trembling despite her obvious efforts to control it. "They followed us. Not like before, not wandering and losing interest. They followed us for 3 blocks, and when we tried to lose them by going through the office building, they split up. They coordinated." The implications settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. The Romero virus, as the scientists had named it before the research facilities went dark, was originally thought to destroy higher brain function, leaving only brainstem aggression and basic motor control. But every week brought new observations that challenged that assumption. Tool use had been reported from survivor groups in other cities, before those groups stopped transmitting. Pack hunting was becoming common. And now, coordinated tactical behavior. The infected were not devolving into mindless zombies. They were evolving into something else entirely, something that retained fragments of human intelligence twisted toward a single purpose, spreading the infection. Nadira worked on Lucien's leg with focused intensity, her sutures small and precise despite the trembling of the injured man and the inadequate lighting from their battery-powered lanterns. Lucien, normally talkative and cheerful despite the circumstances, was biting down on a leather belt to muffle his groans of pain. They had run out of proper anesthetics weeks ago. The young scout had been invaluable to their survival, his ability to move quietly and observe carefully providing the intelligence they needed to plan their scavenging runs. Seeing him broken and bleeding was a stark reminder of their fragility. "Did you at least get the supplies out?" Casimir asked, trying to find some silver lining in the disaster. Yole nodded and shrugged off her backpack, which hit the floor with a promising heavy thud. "Most of it. I dropped some when Lucien fell, but I got the antibiotics and about half the other medications." She began unpacking, bottles of pills, packages of gauze and bandages, precious bottles of clean water. It was a good haul, possibly enough to sustain them for another 2 weeks if they were careful. But the cost had been high, and the tactical situation had deteriorated significantly. Casimir moved back to the window, observing the street below with renewed concern. The infected who had pursued Theron's group were now congregating near their building, not with the random milling pattern they usually displayed, but with an organization that made his architectural mind recognize a perimeter formation. They were being besieged, and the besiegers were learning siege tactics through some terrible inherited memory or evolving intelligence. He counted at least 25, with more shambling into view from surrounding streets, drawn by whatever signal the others were transmitting, pheromones, sound beyond human hearing or something else entirely that science had not identified before civilization collapsed. "We need Quillen," Casimir said quietly, referring to the elderly virologist they had rescued from an overrun laboratory 4 weeks prior. Quillen had been studying the infection, using makeshift equipment salvaged from the pharmaceutical building's research wing. If the infected were evolving, they needed to understand how and how quickly. Knowledge was their only advantage. Humans could think, plan, adapt faster than the infection could evolve. At least, that was the theory Casimir clung to when despair threatened to overwhelm logic. Quillen's makeshift laboratory occupied what had once been a quality control room on the 4th floor of the pharmaceutical building. The elderly scientist hunched over a microscope that ran on a carefully managed battery supply, his white hair unkempt and his hands steady despite his 73 years. Surrounding him were notebooks filled with cramped handwriting, diagrams, and observations that represented humanity's best current understanding of the Romero virus. When Casimir entered, Quillen did not look up from his work, simply grunted in acknowledgement, a habit from his years in academic research where interruptions were common and rarely welcome. "They're coordinating now," Casimir said without preamble. Theron's team was tracked for 3 blocks, and the infected used flanking tactics. That got Quillen's attention. The scientist finally raised his head, his pale eyes sharp behind smudged glasses, his expression troubled. "Flanking? You're certain it wasn't coincidental positioning?" Casimir shook his head. "Theron's a military strategist. He knows the difference between random chance and tactical movement. They're learning, Quillen. Or remembering. Or something." The scientist removed his glasses and cleaned them on his stained lab coat, a thinking gesture Casimir had learned to recognize. "The virus doesn't destroy the brain," Quillen said slowly, as if working through a complex proof. "It rewires it. The initial infection causes massive inflammation and cell death in the prefrontal cortex, which gives us the aggressive, impulsive behavior we observed in the first weeks. But the limbic system remains intact, and there's evidence of new neural pathway formation, crude, but functional. Given time, given stimuli, the infected brain could theoretically relearn certain skills, especially those tied to deep memory structures like procedural memory." Casimir felt his stomach drop. "You're saying they remember how to hunt? How to work together?" Quillen nodded grimly. "Human beings are social predators, Casimir. Cooperation is encoded deeply in our evolutionary history. The virus is parasitic, it needs hosts to spread. Natural selection would favor infected individuals who retained or redeveloped cooperative hunting skills. The smarter ones, the more coordinated ones, they catch more prey, create more infected. Within the infected population, there's evolutionary pressure toward retained intelligence. The implications were staggering and horrifying. The outbreak had happened 6 weeks ago when a containment failure at a biotech company released the experimental virus into Minneapolis's population. Within days, the city had fallen. Within 2 weeks, the state. The military had established quarantine zones, but those had been overrun as the infection spread exponentially. The last confirmed government broadcast had been 3 weeks ago, a desperate message from a bunker in Colorado warning survivors to shelter in place, avoid the infected, and wait for help that sounded increasingly unlikely to arrive. The assumption had been that the infected would eventually succumb to starvation, exposure, or their own violence. But if they were adapting, evolving, learning to coordinate, how long until they're as smart as us? Casimir asked, though he feared the answer. Quillen shook his head slowly. They'll never be exactly like us. The damage to the prefrontal cortex appears permanent, they've lost abstract reasoning, language, long-term planning. But tactical coordination, pattern recognition, basic tool use? We're seeing that already. In another few weeks, if the evolution continues at this rate. He trailed off, but the conclusion was clear. In another few weeks, the infected would be intelligent enough to overcome most of the survival strategies that had kept humans alive thus far. A soft knock at the door interrupted them, and Maeve slipped into the room. The 12-year-old girl was the youngest member of their group, found hiding in a school cafeteria, the only survivor of her family. She had attached herself to Quillen, finding comfort in the elderly scientist's patient explanations and gentle demeanor. Despite the trauma she had endured, Maeve possessed a keen intelligence and observational skills that had proven surprisingly valuable. She had been the first to notice that the infected seemed to avoid areas with certain chemical smells, an observation that had led to their use of ammonia and bleach as deterrents. Nadira says Lucien is stable, Maeve reported, her voice soft but steady. The stitches are holding, and there's no sign of fever yet. She gave him antibiotics from the new supply. Casimir felt a measure of relief. Losing Lucien would have been a devastating blow, both tactically and emotionally. The group was small enough that every person mattered, every skill set was irreplaceable. They were not just a survival unit but a fragile family forged in catastrophe, and each loss diminished them in ways that went beyond simple numbers. Good, Quillen said, managing a tired smile for Maeve. Your help with inventory has been invaluable, child. Do we have enough medical supplies for the next phase? Maeve consulted a notebook she carried. She had taken over inventory management with a meticulousness that belied her age. Antibiotics for maybe 3 weeks if nobody else gets injured. Pain medication is low. Water purification tablets will last about 10 days. Food. She hesitated, and Casimir saw real fear in her young eyes. We're down to about 5 days of canned goods and dry rations, even with strict rationing. The food situation had been deteriorating steadily. The pharmaceutical building had limited supplies to begin with, and their scavenging runs were becoming increasingly dangerous as the infected population in the area grew and evolved. They needed to relocate, to find a more sustainable shelter with access to resources, but moving a group of 7 people through streets filled with infected required planning, coordination, and more than a little luck. Casimir had been working on a plan, but it required perfect execution and carried enormous risks. Gather everyone in the conference room in 1 hour, Casimir decided. It's time we discussed evacuation. This building has served us well, but it's becoming a trap rather than a sanctuary. Quillen nodded agreement, though Casimir could see the weariness in the old man's face. Quillen had survived the initial outbreak through a combination of luck and his laboratory security protocols, but he was not built for prolonged physical hardship. The weeks of poor nutrition, constant stress, and inadequate sleep were taking their toll. Casimir worried that the evacuation journey might be beyond his capabilities, but the alternative was staying until the food ran out or the infected found a way inside. Maeve left to inform the others, and Casimir turned back to Quillen's research materials. Among the notebooks was a map of Minneapolis, marked with observations, infected concentrations, cleared areas, potential resource locations. Quillen had been tracking the spread patterns, trying to predict where the infected would migrate based on their evolving behavior. One location was circled in red, the Como Park area, specifically the conservatory and surrounding structures. "You think we should head there?" Casimir asked, pointing to the marked location. Quillen nodded slowly. "The conservatory has greenhouses, potential for growing food. The zoo facilities nearby have security fencing and multiple defendable structures. There's a large pond for water, which could be purified. And the area is more isolated, less urban density, which should mean fewer infected. It's not perfect, but it's our best option for long-term survival." Long-term survival. The words felt almost absurd given their current circumstances, but Casimir understood the necessity of planning beyond the next meal, the next day. If they were going to survive, they needed to think in weeks and months, not hours. They needed to be smarter than the infected, faster than the virus's evolution, more adaptable than the catastrophe that had consumed the world. The conference room still bore the traces of its corporate past, a large table surrounded by ergonomic chairs, a whiteboard covered in Casimir's strategic diagrams, motivational posters on the walls that now seemed grotesquely ironic. The 7 survivors gathered in the dim light of battery-powered lanterns, their faces showing the wear of 6 weeks in hell. Casimir stood at the head of the table, the map spread before him, while the others took their seats. Nadira sat with her medical kit close at hand, a habit born of necessity. Theron, despite his exhaustion from the supply run, sat alert and focused. Yold had cleaned up but still looked shaken. Lucien was propped in a chair, his injured leg elevated, pain evident in the tightness around his eyes. Quillen had brought his notebooks, and Maeve sat close to the elderly scientist, her young face serious beyond her years. "We can't stay here," Casimir began without preamble. "The food situation is critical, the infected are becoming more aggressive and organized, and this building was never designed for long-term habitation. I know we're all exhausted, and I know the idea of traveling through the city is terrifying, but we have a choice: we can die slowly here, or we can take a calculated risk for a chance at real survival." He let the words settle, watching the reactions. Fear, resignation, but also something else, a flicker of hope. People needed purpose, needed a goal beyond mere existence. Survival was not enough, they needed a future to fight for. Theron leaned forward, his strategic mind already engaged. "What's the destination?" Casimir pointed to the circled area on the map. "Como Park. Specifically, the conservatory and zoo facilities. Quillen has identified it as our best option for sustainable long-term survival, food production, water source, defendable perimeter, lower infected density." Yold studied the map, her engineering background making her assess the logistics. "That's over 5 miles from here. Through the city. With Lucien injured and Quillen." She glanced at the elderly scientist apologetically, but he waved off her concern. "I'm old, not dead yet," Quillen said dryly. "Though I appreciate your tact, Yold." "Casimir, what's the proposed route?" Casimir used a marker to trace a path on the map, his architect's knowledge of the city proving invaluable. "We'll avoid the main streets, too much infected concentration. Instead, we'll use the utility corridors, connecting buildings where possible, and move through residential areas that should have lower density. I've identified 3 potential rest points where we can shelter if we encounter trouble or need to wait out daylight hours. The trip will take 2, possibly 3 days if we move carefully." Nadira's expression was skeptical. 2 days traveling with an injured man, a child, and an elderly scientist, while carrying all our essential supplies, through a city full of infected that are actively hunting us. What could possibly go wrong? The sarcasm was sharp, but Casimir understood it was born of fear and responsibility. Nadira had kept them alive through countless injuries and illnesses. The thought of losing someone during the evacuation weighed heavily on her. Everything could go wrong, Casimir admitted. But everything will definitely go wrong if we stay. At least this way, we're making an active choice for survival rather than passive acceptance of death. Theron spoke up, his military training evident in his analysis. We'll need a defensive formation, scouts ahead and rear guard, and a protocol for if we encounter large groups of infected. Running isn't an option with Lucien's mobility compromised, which means we need deterrence, distractions, possibly diversions. He looked at Yold. You're the engineer. What can we build with the materials we have? Yold's eyes lit up with the challenge, her fear transforming into focused problem-solving. Noise makers, battery-powered radios or alarms that we can set on timers to draw infected away from our route. Smoke devices using materials from the pharmaceutical lab to obscure our movement. Maybe some simple barricades we can deploy quickly if we need to create a choke point. The discussion continued, each person contributing their expertise. Maeve suggested using the ammonia solution that repelled the infected to mask their scent along the route, applied strategically to create safe corridors. Quillen proposed timing their movement for early morning when the infected seemed least active, based on his behavioral observations. Lucien, speaking through gritted teeth against his pain, described potential shortcuts and hidden passages he had discovered during his scouting missions. The plan began to take shape, evolving from a desperate gamble into a carefully orchestrated operation that utilized each person's strengths. As they worked, Casimir felt something he had not experienced since the outbreak began, a sense of agency, of control over their fate. The infected might be evolving, might be learning to coordinate and hunt, but humans had something the virus could never replicate, the ability to innovate, to create complex multi-layered strategies, to use abstract reasoning and imagination to anticipate problems before they arose. This was how they would outsmart the zombies, not through superior strength or speed, but through superior intelligence, adaptability, and cooperation. Hours passed as they refined the plan, anticipated contingencies, and assigned roles. Yold would lead the engineering effort, creating their diversionary devices and defensive tools. Theron would handle tactical planning and serve as primary navigator, with Casimir as secondary. Nadira would manage medical needs and help support Lucien during the journey. Quillen would carry the essential research materials and medication supplies, while Maeve would handle the inventory of food and water, ensuring fair distribution and conservation. Each person had a purpose, a responsibility that made them essential to the group's survival. Finally, as exhaustion began to overtake adrenaline, Casimir called for a vote. This is a decision we all have to make together. We're a group, not a dictatorship. Everyone needs to agree, or we don't go. One by one, they voted. Theron, yes. Yold, yes. Nadira, a reluctant yes. Quillen, yes. Maeve, yes, with a determination that was heartbreaking in someone so young. Lucien raised his hand from his chair, his voice weak but resolute, yes. It was unanimous. In 48 hours, they would leave the pharmaceutical building and make their desperate journey across a city of the infected, betting their lives on their ability to think, plan, and outsmart an enemy that was learning to think as well. As the meeting broke up and people dispersed to begin preparations, Nadira pulled Casimir aside. Her expression was troubled, her dark eyes searching his face. "You really think we can make it?" she asked quietly. Casimir wanted to lie, to offer false reassurance, but Nadira deserved honesty. "I think we have a chance," he said. "Maybe 30–40% odds. But that's better than the 0% chance we have if we stay here until the food runs out." She nodded slowly, accepting the brutal mathematics of survival. Then, unexpectedly, she hugged him, a brief, fierce embrace that spoke of shared fear and fragile hope. When she pulled back, her professional mask was back in place. "Then let's make sure we beat the odds," she said, and went to prepare her medical supplies for the journey ahead. The next 48 hours passed in a flurry of controlled activity. Yold transformed a corner of the building into a workshop, cannibalizing electronic equipment and chemicals from the pharmaceutical stores to create their diversionary devices. She worked with intense focus, her hands steady as she wired timers to portable radios and small speakers, creating noise bombs that could be set to activate at predetermined intervals. The theory was simple but effective: the infected were drawn to sound, so strategic noise in carefully chosen locations could pull them away from the group's actual path, creating corridors of relative safety. Theron spent hours studying the map, cross-referencing it with Lucien's scouting reports and Quillen's infected migration patterns. He identified potential choke points where they might be trapped, alternate routes if their primary path was blocked, and buildings that could serve as emergency shelters. His military background had prepared him for tactical planning, but this was unlike any operation he had trained for, evacuating civilians through hostile territory where the enemy was numerous, tireless, and evolving in unpredictable ways. The pressure showed in the tightness of his jaw and the dark circles under his eyes, but his planning was meticulous and thorough. Nadira prepared a portable medical kit, making difficult decisions about what to carry and what to leave behind. Weight was a critical factor, they needed to move quickly, and every ounce mattered. She prioritized antibiotics, pain medication, bandages, and antiseptic, reluctantly leaving behind bulkier items. She also prepared individual medical packs for each person, teaching them basic first aid and what to do if she was injured or separated from the group. The lessons were grim but necessary, delivered in her characteristic clinical manner that somehow made even the prospect of treating sucking chest wounds seem manageable. Quillen carefully packed his research materials, prioritizing his notebooks and a few irreplaceable biological samples stored in a makeshift cold storage unit. Decades of scientific training made him want to preserve everything, but survival demanded pragmatism. He kept what was essential for understanding the virus and potentially developing a treatment or vaccine, and left the rest. To Maeve, he entrusted his most important notebook, making her memorize which building and room it had come from in case something happened to him and future researchers needed to know his findings. The trust he showed her was evident, and the girl accepted the responsibility with solemn determination. Maeve herself was busy with inventory management and preparing the food and water supplies for transport. She divided everything into multiple packs, ensuring that if they lost one, they would not lose all their provisions. She also created a rationing schedule for the journey, calculating caloric needs against available supplies with mathematical precision that would have impressed her teachers in the world before. Between tasks, she helped Yold with the simpler assembly work, her small fingers useful for delicate wiring. She did not complain, did not cry, did not show the fear she must have felt. Casimir wondered what the psychological cost would be for a child forced to grow up so fast in such horror, but survival took precedence over therapy. Lucien, confined to limited mobility by his injury, served as a quality control inspector, testing the devices Yold built and reviewing Theron's tactical plans. His scouting experience made him invaluable for identifying flaws in their strategy, and despite his pain, he contributed critical insights. He also led the group through weapons training, ensuring everyone knew how to use the crossbows, makeshift spears, and close-quarters weapons they had assembled. In a world where guns were suicidal noisemakers, proficiency with silent weapons was essential. Even Maeve learned to load and fire a crossbow, though the weapon was nearly as tall as she was. Casimir coordinated everything, troubleshooting problems, mediating disputes, and maintaining morale. He also made a final survey of the building, mentally cataloging what they were leaving behind and ensuring they had extracted maximum value from their temporary sanctuary. As an architect, he appreciated the building's solid construction, the security features that had kept them safe. As a survivor, he knew they had depleted its usefulness. The pharmaceutical building had been a chrysalis, protecting them through the initial chaos of the outbreak. Now they needed to emerge and find a place where they could truly live, not merely hide. On the final night before the evacuation, Casimir stood at his usual window, observing the infected in the streets below. Their numbers had grown, he counted over 40 now, congregating in loose formations that suggested coordination. Some were stationary, swaying slightly like disturbing organic statues. Others patrolled in rough patterns, their movements less random than they had been weeks ago. As he watched, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Two infected were manipulating an object, working together to move a dumpster, apparently trying to access something behind it. Tool use. Cooperation. Problem solving. The evolution was accelerating. Behind him, he heard soft footsteps and turned to find Nadira joining him at the window. She observed the scene below with professional detachment, though he saw her fingers tighten on the windowsill. "They're getting smarter faster than Quillen predicted," she said quietly. Casimir nodded. "Which means we're leaving at exactly the right time. Another week, maybe two, and I'm not sure our strategies would work anymore." They stood in silence, two people who had become leaders through necessity rather than choice, watching the enemy that had destroyed civilization and threatened to destroy them as well. "Do you think there are others?" Nadira asked suddenly. "Other survivors, other groups, people who got out of the cities or found safe places?" Casimir wanted to believe there were, wanted to think that humanity had not been reduced to small scattered pockets clinging to survival in ruins and abandoned buildings. "I hope so," he said honestly. "Because if we're going to rebuild, if we're going to find a cure or a way to coexist with this nightmare, we'll need more than 7 people. We'll need communities, cooperation, shared knowledge." Nadira smiled sadly. Always the architect, thinking about building even when everything is falling apart. He returned the smile. "Someone has to imagine the future, or we're just waiting to die." They remained at the window until the battery-powered alarm signaled midnight, then retreated to get what sleep they could before the most dangerous journey of their lives began. Dawn came cold and gray, mist rising from the streets to create an eerie atmosphere that reduced visibility to about 50 yards. Theron had identified this as ideal conditions. The infected seemed disoriented by fog, their primary hunting sense of sight compromised, making them rely on hearing and their uncertain sense of smell. The ammonia solution Maeve had prepared would help mask human scent, though it made their eyes water and breathing uncomfortable. The group assembled in the ground floor service entrance, each person wearing layered clothing scavenged from the building's lost and found and abandoned offices, their backpacks loaded with carefully distributed supplies. Casimir did a final check of each person. Theron at point, armed with a crossbow and machete, his tactical vest loaded with the noise-making devices and smoke generators. Yold behind him, carrying engineering tools and backup diversionary equipment. Quillen in the protected center position, his precious research materials in a weatherproof pack. Maeve beside the scientist, her small backpack containing food and water, a knife at her belt that she had been taught to use only as absolute last resort. Nadira supporting Lucien, the injured scout leaning on a makeshift crutch, pain medication dulling the worst of his suffering but leaving him mobile enough to walk slowly. Casimir himself taking the rear guard position, constantly monitoring their back trail for pursuit. "Everyone remembers the protocol?" Casimir asked quietly. Nods all around. If they encountered a small group of infected, 5 or fewer, they would deploy a noise device and move perpendicular to the distraction, putting distance between themselves and the threat. If they encountered a larger group, they would deploy smoke and retreat to the nearest identified shelter, waiting out the danger. If they were separated, they would proceed to the next designated waypoint and wait no more than 2 hours before moving on. No heroes, no unnecessary risks. Survival of the group took absolute priority over survival of individuals, a harsh calculation that everyone had accepted. Theron removed the barricade from the service entrance, the sound of moving wood and metal seeming impossibly loud in the pre-dawn quiet. They waited, barely breathing, listening for the telltale clicking that meant infected had noticed. 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing. Theron eased the door open, checking the immediate area with hand signals they had practiced: clear left, clear right, clear forward. He stepped out into the mist, and one by one, the others followed, becoming ghosts in the gray morning. The first 2 blocks were almost anticlimactically uneventful. They moved through alleyways and parking lots, avoiding the main streets, their footsteps muffled by the fog and their own careful placement. They passed evidence of the outbreak's violence, abandoned cars with doors hanging open, dark stains on pavement that had once been people, trash and debris scattered from looting and panic. The city was a corpse, and they were microorganisms moving through its remains, trying to find viable tissue in the decay. At the third block, they encountered their first obstacle. A group of 7 infected occupied the intersection they needed to cross, standing in that disturbing swaying posture that had become common. Theron raised a fist, full stop. Yold moved forward carefully, placed one of her noise devices in the doorway of a building to their left, and set the timer for 60 seconds. They retreated into cover and waited. The device activated with a burst of static and then began playing music, a cheerful pop song that had been popular before the world ended, now serving as a lure for monsters. The infected reacted immediately, heads snapping toward the sound, bodies lurching into motion. Within seconds, all 7 had converged on the building, leaving the intersection clear. The group moved quickly across the open space, Casimir counting seconds in his head. They had maybe 3 minutes before the infected lost interest in the device and resumed their previous positions. They made it to cover with time to spare, ducking into the ground floor of an office building and pausing to regroup. Lucien was breathing hard, his face pale with pain and effort, but he waved off Nadira's concern. "I can make it," he insisted through gritted teeth. "Just need a minute." They gave him 5, rationing their time like they rationed everything else. The pattern repeated through the morning. Move carefully, avoid detection, deploy devices when necessary to clear their path. Twice they used smoke generators to obscure their movement through areas with higher infected density. Once they sheltered in a parking garage for 20 minutes when a larger group, over 15 infected moving in a coordinated pack, passed through their planned route. Hidden behind vehicles, barely breathing, they watched the infected move past with a purposefulness that was deeply unsettling. These were not mindless zombies wandering randomly. These were hunters searching for prey, and only the fog and ammonia masking kept the group from being detected. By midday, they reached their first designated waypoint, a 2-story house in a residential area that Lucien had identified during his scouting missions. The door was unlocked, the interior showing signs of hasty departure but no indication of infected occupation. They entered cautiously, clearing each room before allowing themselves to relax marginally. Nadira immediately checked Lucien's injury, changing the bandages and administering more antibiotics and pain medication. The wound was holding, no signs of infection, but the constant movement was taking its toll. "I can make it to Como Park," Lucien insisted, but his weakness was evident. They rested for 2 hours, eating a rationed meal of canned food and purified water, speaking in whispers despite the relative security. Quillen reviewed the map with Theron and Casimir, comparing their progress to the plan. They were slightly ahead of schedule, having covered about 2 miles with fewer complications than anticipated. The next leg would take them through a more densely populated area, apartment complexes, and commercial districts where infected concentration would be higher. They would need to move during the late afternoon when Quillen's observation suggested infected were least active, a lull in their behavior pattern that might correspond to circadian rhythms retained from their human past. As they prepared to move out, Maeve discovered something in the house's kitchen, a wall calendar with photos of the family who had lived there. Parents, 2 children, a dog. All smiling, frozen in a moment of happiness that was now ashen memory. The girl stared at the images for a long moment before Quillen gently guided her away. "We carry them with us," the old scientist said softly. "Everyone who was lost, everyone who didn't make it. We carry them by surviving, by remembering that this world was once different and could be different again." Maeve nodded, slipping the calendar into her pack, a reminder of what they were fighting for, beyond mere survival. The afternoon journey tested them more severely. The infected density increased as predicted, forcing them to use more of their diversionary devices and take longer detours. At one point, They had to backtrack half a mile when their route was blocked by a large group congregating around what appeared to be a fresh kill, another survivor who had not been as careful or lucky. The sight was devastating, a reminder of their own fragility, but they could not afford to dwell on it. They moved on, robots of survival, pushing aside emotion to focus on the mechanical necessities of staying alive. As dusk approached, they reached their second waypoint, an abandoned veterinary clinic that offered security and, crucially, medical supplies that Nadira could use. They would shelter here for the night, rest, and make the final push to Como Park in the morning. They had covered 4 miles, 3/4 of their journey, and lost no one. Against all odds, the plan was working. But Casimir knew the final stretch would be the most dangerous, through areas they had not scouted, into unknown territory where their carefully planned strategies might encounter unforeseen complications. As he took the first watch, staring out into the gathering darkness where shapes moved with terrible purpose, he allowed himself a moment of cautious hope. They might actually make it. Humans might outsmart zombies one more time. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The veterinary clinic smelled of animals and antiseptic, a ghost of its former purpose. The group settled into the main examination room, barricading the doors and windows with professional thoroughness born of weeks of practice. Nadira discovered a cache of medical supplies that made her eyes light up, antibiotics suitable for humans, pain medications, even some surgical equipment that might prove invaluable. She restocked her kit with methodical care while the others ate a cold meal, avoiding fire or anything that might attract attention. Outside, the infected moved through the streets in their now familiar patterns, and the group listened to the clicking sounds that no longer merely terrified them but had become a known element of their environment, something to be monitored and managed rather than simply feared. During Casimir's watch, Theron joined him at the window, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. The two men stood in companionable silence, watching the night-shrouded city. "After we reach Como Park, then what?" Theron asked quietly. It was a question Casimir had been contemplating, the architect in him always thinking about the next phase, the next structure to build. "We establish security, set up sustainable food and water systems, create a genuine defensible perimeter. Then we start thinking about reaching out to other survivors, building a network, sharing information. Maybe Quillen can continue his research with better facilities. Maybe we can find a way to fight back." Theron nodded slowly. "Fight back. I like the sound of that. I'm tired of just running and hiding." Casimir understood the sentiment. Survival was necessary, but it was not sufficient. Humans needed purpose, needed to feel they were working towards something beyond merely existing another day. Como Park could be that, not just a shelter but a foundation, a place to build from, a foothold in the apocalypse from which they might push back against the darkness. "One step at a time," Casimir said. "First we get there. Then we build. Then we fight." The night passed without incident, a small mercy that let them rest and recover some strength. As dawn approached, gray and cold like the previous day, they prepared for the final leg of their journey. Lucien's condition had stabilized but not improved, the constant movement was taking its toll, and he could barely put weight on his injured leg. Nadira fashioned a better crutch from materials in the clinic, but it was clear he was reaching the limits of his endurance. "Just a couple more miles," he kept repeating, a mantra of determination against pain and exhaustion. They moved out in the early morning light, the mist providing cover once again. The residential areas gave way to more open terrain as they approached Como Park, houses spaced further apart, more vegetation, a transition from urban to suburban that should have meant lower infected density. Should have. As they crossed into the park's outer area, moving through a wooded section that offered concealment, Theron suddenly raised his fist, full stop. Ahead, visible through the trees, was a sight that made Casimir's heart sink. The Como Park Conservatory, their destination and hoped for sanctuary, was surrounded by infected. Not dozens. Hundreds. They filled the parking lots and grounds, pressed against the glass walls of the conservatory, moving in patterns that suggested they had been there for some time. And in the center of the mass, Casimir could see what had drawn them: survivors inside the conservatory, visible through the glass, trapped and besieged. Smoke rose from somewhere within the structure, suggesting fire or perhaps a signal attempt. The conservatory that was supposed to be their salvation was already occupied and under siege. The group retreated into deeper cover, gathering to assess this devastating development. Their destination was compromised, their plan in ruins, and they had limited supplies to support an extended search for alternatives. Theron spread the map on the ground, looking for options, but the reality was stark: they had bet everything on Como Park, and that bet had failed. Despair settled over the group like a physical weight. Maeve began to cry quietly, the first time she had broken down, the accumulated stress and fear finally overwhelming her careful control. Quillen comforted her, his old hands gentle on her shoulders, but his own expression was bleak. Casimir forced himself to think, to push past the despair and analyze the situation. Hundreds of infected, but concentrated in one area, focused on the conservatory. Which meant other parts of the park might be relatively clear. The zoo facilities, Quillen had mentioned them as part of the plan. Separate buildings, security fencing, further from the conservatory. Possibly viable if they could reach them without drawing the attention of the massive infected horde. He pointed to the map, showing the others. The Lion House. The Primate Building. They're designed to contain dangerous animals, which means strong construction and security features. If we can get there. Theron studied the map, his tactical mind engaging despite the despair. We'd have to circle wide, approach from the north, stay in the wooded areas. It's another mile of travel, and we'd be operating without scouting intelligence. The risks were enormous, but the alternative was attempting to return to the city with depleted supplies and no destination. Nadira looked at Lucien, worry clear on her face. Can you make another mile? The scout's face was ashen, his breathing labored, but he nodded. I didn't come this far to quit now. One by one, they agreed. The zoo facilities would be their new objective. The plan adapted because plans had to adapt or you died. They moved carefully around the conservatory area, using every bit of cover, deploying their remaining noise devices to create distractions that pulled infected away from their path. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation had become their constant companion. Twice they had close calls, infected passing within yards of their hiding spots, the ammonia solution and sheer luck keeping them undetected. Yold used the last of her smoke generators to obscure their movement across an open area, the chemical fog mixing with natural mist to create a nearly impenetrable curtain that bought them precious minutes. The zoo's perimeter fence appeared through the trees like a promised land. 8 feet of sturdy chain link topped with angled barriers designed to keep animals in would serve equally well to keep infected out. Theron found a service gate that he was able to force open with his crowbar, the chain securing it old enough to break with determined effort. They slipped through into the zoo grounds and immediately felt the difference. This area was largely clear, only a handful of infected visible at distance. The animal enclosures, empty now of their former inhabitants, offered multiple secure locations. The Lion House, a solid brick structure with heavy doors and small windows, stood like a fortress.